I like working with bias binding on my quilts because it gives a nice smooth finish. However, I was taught that it takes more fabric to do bias binding than straight binding. And I thought, now that's interesting. How can it take more fabric? Well, it's not how much fabric is on the quilt. However, it's how it's cut and how it's produced. If we're doing long straight strips of binding that we're cutting, then we're going to be cutting on a diagonal, and we won't use the corners of the fabric because we don't want a lot of short strips. We want all long strips if we can. You can do continuous bias binding, and that is generally taught using a square of fabric. So then you have the extra fabric on the side of the rectangle that doesn't get used. What I'm going to share with you is how to cut continuous bias binding from a rectangle, and you'll be able to use all of the bias that you cut. So let me show you how that works. This is from the Quilt Binding Bible. Starting with a rectangle or square of fabric, you can make one diagonal cut and sew two seams, like you can see here, and you end up getting a piece of fabric that's in a tube, and we can just start cutting and peeling off this bias binding all in one long continuous piece. Let me show you how that works. Here I have a fat quarter, which is actually a perfect size for a small amount of binding, and it's a rectangle, and we're going to leave it as a rectangle. I'll show you how you know which way to lay things out. But first thing we have to do is trim off the ends and square it up. Get rid of selvages and square up the edges. We're going to line up the selvage with the cut edge, and we're going to place our ruler so that the ruler line is along the fold, and we're going to trim off the least amount. So we want to get the most out of this fat quarter, so we're going to trim off the least amount there. And then we take and do the same thing on the other end, keeping the selvage and the cut edge the same. And we're going to do this so that the fold is the same. And we're going to line this up and cut the least amount off. Okay, it's about right there. Because we made the ruler parallel to the fold, and the folds are square because of where we place the ruler, all of this is going to work well. Now we have to cut off and square up the other edges, and we're going to take now and we line up these cut edges all the way across since it's such a small piece. And then we take and cut this off. Again, pick a rule line along there, and we trim the least amount off. And because we have these lined up, they're parallel to our fold, and the fact that we're lining up our ruler, we're getting a square piece of fabric. Okay, and we're going to cut the minimum off there. We've got a lot of selvage there. So this is our rectangle. We want to have it to where it is horizontal, and I think you can see that it's longer than it is tall. So we have the piece of fabric horizontal, and we have it right side up. We're going to take this bottom layer here, and we're going to fold it up so that we have this edge lined up there, and then we're going to kind of finger press all the way down. So we finger press, and we should have the same amount of fabric all the way up this strip here. And once I have that done, I'm going to use my thumbnail to do a little bit of a better press here. And now I'm going to rotary cut that fold, and I'm just going to take my ruler and line it up and just nip that last bit of the fold. Just that last bit. Okay, we have that cut off. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this, unfold it, and then slide it over here. And we're going to sew these two pieces together. So we'll put right sides together. And we're going to line up this square end first. And that means that this point down here with the triangle, it's not going to have an ear pointing out. We're going to have this square down at this end, and then we'll line this up and the point will be right there at the edge. We're going to go ahead and sew that, and then we're going to press the seam open. I'll be right back. Here is the fabric now that I've sewn it together, and I have pressed the seam allowance open, and this is exactly where I sewed it on. Now before we cut, we're going to rotate this so that we have the larger size, the one that's the rectangular length. We're going to have that over on the left hand side. We're going to cut 2-inch strips. I've got that marked on my ruler, and we're just going to cut this first little bit, 12 inches or so of that width. And now we're going to take this and we're going to bring this point down here. We've already cut this off. We're going to take this point and we're going to match it up here with this top. And we're going to have this whole thing kind of twist around on itself, and we're going to sew this seam allowance. This one will start with a ear sticking out. That's the width of your seam allowance. And we're going to sew the seam all the way across here, and the end of it will look something like this. I'll show you whenever I get back from sewing this together. Here's the seam that I just sewed, and we have the ear that was sticking out, and it goes along here, and at the end we're going to have about 2 inches sticking out off the edge. And turn it inside out. I should say right side out. And then we now have a tube that we can take and we can cut our 2-inch wide piece off of this. We can use the tail here as a guide that we carefully cut with scissors, following that line, and just continue using that end and making sure you don't trim it, making it narrower. You can also take and put a small mat in there, just making sure you have it in there, a small mat, and see where the edges are, and you can rotary cut this very carefully. And it is biased, so you don't want to pull and tug on it. But I can see where my end of my mat is right there. So I'm going to take and cut just that little bit, and we can just keep rotating this and cutting using our mat and our rotary cutter ruler. The other thing you can do is put this on top of your ironing board and have your mat on the ironing board, and then the ironing board slips into this unit. And we've got our 2 inches there. It's a little, there's a little nick in there, right, that one spot. So I'm going to make it a little bit wider and be able to trim that back a little bit. So I'm going to have that overlap just a little bit. Sometimes that happens. No big deal. And we need to get this back here. Make sure we know where our mat is. We're going to aim for getting past that point right there. Okay. So I'll come back and straighten that up to 2 inches in just a little bit. Again, have your mat underneath there and keep cutting your 2 inches. So we'll get this back in line. Okay. And this right here, I'll just go ahead and show that. We'll come back to that and trim it up to that 2-inch wide. And because we're working with bias, it works pretty easily to straighten that up. We can ease that variance in. Okay, so we just keep cutting and we'll get our 2-inch binding that's continuous. As you work through this, make sure you have your mat between the 2 layers down in the tube. And then we're going to make sure, just keep double checking. You want to just make sure that you don't accidentally cut down into your binding. Just takes a little extra effort. So as we're coming down to the last part of it, we can still cut another 2-inch strip, and you'll see how it comes to an end. And we'll see if we can get more 2-inch out of it, because this usually doesn't work out this tight. But you'll want to measure and see, is all of the rest of this 2 inches wide? Quite often it's not. And it looks like it'll be close enough because we've got bias. It gets a little narrow. It's a little narrow right in there, but actually this looks great. Right in here, it's not wide enough, so I'm going to take and cut that off. And here's the pile, and I'm just going to wrap this up. I do not fold my binding in half. I just wrap it up. It kind of starts to twist on me, but the reason I don't fold it in half or press it in half is because you need more fabric on the outside than you do on the inside whenever you're working with your wrapping the binding around once you've attached it. So there's my binding that I need for 2 inches for a project ready to go. Okay, so now we have our long continuous bias binding. We made 1 short cut, 2 seams, and then 1 long cut. And that takes a little bit of effort. However, it's worth it because we get the use of all of our fabric. So that's how to do continuous bias binding. I'm Marci Baker. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoy your quilting even more.